Sorry I can't see you in person, and enjoy one of the hotels on the beach or something like that. That's always nice this time of year. But hope everybody's gathered and we'll have some information to share and we'll all get something out of these meetings. So without any further ado, since I can't see you, I might as well start sharing my screen and go into my slides. Hopefully you can see that. So today we're going to talk about some advanced cover cropping methods with the aim of improving nutrient cycling and seeing if we can't get better soil fertility and maybe lower fertilizer bills in the process. So you all know you've been hearing a lot about cover crops over the last few years. And the reason for that, of course, is that they're really a useful tool that farmers had not been using for half a century or more and really hadn't taken seriously. And they allow farmers to do a lot of things that otherwise they probably wouldn't be able to do in the way of planting a lot more plant variability or diversity on their farms other than just the crops they can sell. And of course, trying to keep that living root in the soil, keeping the soil biology active year round. So today we're going to focus on nutrient cycling, and there are a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're setting out to give advice or to make plans on cover crop use for this. First, of course, we need to figure out what our nutrient management goals are, and that goes beyond just nitrogen and phosphorus pollution levels, but soil fertility and crop productivity. We should have some short-term and long-term goals. Definitely want to know what species is going to follow this cover crop, because soybeans have very different needs than corn, for instance. And then we should have a look at our soil test history and our cropping history and any tissue tests that we have, so we can identify if there are particular issues in the field, like there may have been history of boron deficiency in the field or sulfur or potassium needs and that kind of thing, all of which cover crops have the potential to help us with. I'm going to present information about cover crop species and families today so that we can actually choose our cover crops with these goals in mind. Then we get into the issues of when and how to plant. When to plant is a hugely important thing. Just saying you have a cover crop doesn't mean much. It really depends on what you planted, and when you planted it is probably at least as important as what you plant. So there's no sense wasting money on good cover crop seed and then planting it late. There's also a question of how much do you want to invest in a cover crop. My good friend Steve Groff up in Pennsylvania, one of the cover crop gurus of the world, always says that cover crops should be treated like a cash crop. So you might want to make an investment. If you want them to perform, you're going to have to get good seed. You might want to irrigate it if you have irrigation in a dry fall. You might even want to fertilize the cover crop if necessary. There may be some situations in which that would pay back, and we're looking into that. And then on the other end of the cover crop season in spring, you have to decide when you're going to terminate. After nutrient availability or carbon, those are different goals, and also how to terminate with herbicides or rolling, mowing. Even on small scale, you can use things like tarps. So lots of different things to think about. This issue of cover crop planting date is really important. You'll see it come up a number of times during my talk. This is some data that we collected in the late 2000s this is particularly on forage radish, which is a cover crop that I introduced to North America into this region about 20 years ago. So I've done quite a bit of research on it, and we did look at different planting dates. And you can see for instance, in this lower graph that shows total dry matter. Let me get my laser pointer on here. This is looking at total dry matter and planting date, so 26th of August all the way through the 28th of October. Basically, once you get into these October planting dates, you never did produce much dry matter, and this was measured late in the fall, in early December. And it drops off quite rapidly. To put this another way, if we're looking at nitrogen uptake, which is one of the big functions that radishes are good at, this is average over a number of sites in 2 years. You can see that once you start getting less than about 600 growing degree days with a base of 5 degrees centigrade, that's about 40 degrees for those of you that aren't doing metrics yet. Sooner or later, we're going to all do metrics. So that's a little bit more generous than with corn. Corn, you have a base of 50. So the growing degree days add up a little faster, but you do need to have 600 to maybe 900 to make it worthwhile to plant a cover crop in the fall. Actually, not just radish. The radish is going to die, but the other cover crops also are not going to perform in the fall. And as we'll see, fall performance is really important for the fertility point, from the fertility point of view, as well as water quality point of view. Some of the lessons that we learned from a project that we did for a number of years, which earned Sarah Hirsch. A lot of you may know Sarah Hirsch. She's now in extension on the lower shore. And she got her PhD over a period of years working really hard on this unique project in which we were investigating the deep soil layers. We went down to about 7 feet, a little more than 2 meters. And everywhere we went, we found nitrogen. Basically, we went to dozens of fields throughout the region. And as you can see from this graph, it didn't matter too much whether we were in the hills of Maryland and Pennsylvania on the western shore in the Piedmont, or whether we were on the coastal plain. If we went down to the full profile, we were finding on average over 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So a lot of nitrogen, and a lot of it deeper than the usual 30 centimeters or 1 foot that we might sample even for a PS&T sampling. Can we get that nitrogen, or is it all going to end up in the bay? Well, that's what we were wondering. And so we did quite a bit of research on that to see what we could do to recover that nitrogen. Now, one thing we learned along the way is that this is not just fertilizer nitrogen. This is also nitrogen coming out of organic matter, crop residues, lots of different sources. And these sources are over a period of years. So you can't just tie it to 1 year's fertilization. I think the old, obsolete way of thinking about this is, well, if I fertilized for my corn and put on 150 pounds of nitrogen, and then we had a drought year and the corn was a failure, there's going to be a lot of nitrogen left. But if I had a good crop of corn, you should have used it all up. That is not what we're finding. All of these, just about all of these sites were after good yields. And this is at the end of the season, after the corn or the soybeans have finished taking up nutrients, and we're still finding all that nitrogen down there. Actually, we find a little bit more of the nitrate after soybeans than after corn. And that's probably because soybeans are a legume, they fix nitrogen, and their residues decompose quickly and don't tie up nitrogen the way corn residues and corn roots might. We also did work with Sarah using stable isotopes of nitrogen to see how deep the cover crops could go to recover some of that nitrogen. So we saw it was there, ton of nitrogen out there, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 500 or 600 pounds of nitrogen per acre in ammonia nitrate forms. At the end of the crop growing season, when the crop is finished taking up its nutrients. So that's about a month or 5-6 weeks before harvest usually. The crop stops taking up nutrients long before it's ready to harvest, while it's senescent. And so we're wondering, can you actually pick that up? And so we buried it down there. We buried it at 60, 120, 180 centimeters. So that's 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet deep. Buried, labeled fertilizer with N15, and then filled in the hole and sealed it over with clay and planted a cover crop over it. And then came by in late fall, around Thanksgiving, and harvested that cover crop and looked for that label. And if we planted early, that is around the 1st of September or earlier, we found a lot of the label from the 2 foot, from the 4 foot. We even found some label, and this was significant, from 6 feet deep in that cover crop. So we know that the roots are getting down there. They're getting down there quick if we plant early and we plant the right cover crops. So this is with rye and with forage radish, tillage radish, some people call it. So those are deep rooting cover crops. Probably tillage radish is the champion on this. If we plant it later, so about a month later, end of September, 1st of October, we picked up a little bit from 2 feet, almost nothing from 4 feet. We didn't even look at 6 feet. So we have good information that indicates if you don't plant it early, you're not going to capture all that deep nitrogen and clean it up. So this really changes the way we look at nitrogen leaching, the loss of nitrogen over the winter. We know the leaching takes place during the winter. And I think a lot of us had in mind that, well, if we get the cover crop in, even if it's planted late, we got that little cover crop, you know, the rye is sticking up, you know, 3-4 inches, and we know it's got some roots and it's taking up nitrogen all winter long, and that should help a little bit, right? That should at least be removing some nitrogen. Well, it's going to protect a little bit from soil erosion, but I don't think it's going to do anything for capturing that deep nitrogen. So let's take a look at what we now think we know about nitrogen. So this is calendar runs from July through June. So this is spring of, we planted corn, and then nitrogen is taken up after a little delay, the corn gets going. And we can continue that in July, corn is growing. And then by the time the corn is starting to form grain, it's really pretty much, you know, halfway through the grain forming period, it's pretty much finished taking up nitrogen. It's not going to take up much more nutrients after that. The roots are dying. The plant is cannibalizing the old leaves and sending those nutrients into the grain. So the nitrogen levels off then. So we have a lot of nitrogen now in the corn crop, and that's going to get harvested. If we can get a cover crop planted before we harvest the corn crop, notice we've got this overlapping by probably maybe a month or so. So the cover crop starts growing, then it'll start taking up, you know, it'll be a kind of a relay. Corn is quit, but the cover crop will start taking up nitrogen. It'll grow in the fall as long as it has growing degree days, kind of dormant during the winter. And then when things warm up again in March and April, it takes off again. That's nitrogen in the early planted cover crop. If we wait a few weeks and plant right after harvest, say October 1st, we never get much nitrogen in the cover crop. At best, it'll look something like this. You get, you know, a small stand with a few pounds per acre of nitrogen. So if we plant early, we might get 100 pounds or more per acre in the cover crop. If we plant a few weeks later, it might be down to 5 or 10. If we look at what's going on below ground, you know, the leaching starts about the time the weather gets cooler and the crops are starting to lose their green. Tree starts losing their leaves. So the water's going down instead of coming up by evapotranspiration. So all winter long, we have about the same total precipitation each month on average. So that precipitation has nowhere to go but down during the winter instead of being used up. So there's very little leaching takes place during the summer. It's mostly a winter phenomenon. If we look at the amount of nitrogen leaching without a cover crop, that happens as soon as the weather gets cooler and water starts moving down. With an early planted cover crop, we should be able to slow down most of that. Largely not because we're stopping the water. We might be reducing the amount of water, but because as the water goes through the profile, that profile has already been cleaned up. There's not much soluble nitrogen in there, so the water can run through without carrying much nitrogen with it. If we delay, we don't make much impact on the nitrogen loss by leaching. So it's all about those growing degree days in the early fall, late summer, and having enough growing weather to get roots down deep in the profile and pull those nutrients, not just nitrogen. Of course, the bay program's interested in nitrogen, keeping it out of the bay, but I'm thinking now in terms of keeping these nutrients on the farm and bringing them back up to where the cash crops can use it. So let's look at this from another point of view. With a sort of an ordinary late planted cover crop, not under great conditions. So we now know that there's a lot of nitrate throughout the profile in August and September. During the winter, shortly thereafter, during the fall and winter and spring, water is going to be percolating through the profile. If we planted late, we have this little cover crop. So during the fall, there's not a whole lot of roots there. Root growth is pretty small. Shoot growth is pretty small. Now, maybe actually more below ground than above ground. Certainly, it's going to be deeper than what you see above ground at this stage. And then in spring, we may get substantial growth and then terminate it, right? So we take up a little bit of nitrogen in fall, but it isn't usually much. You know, if you've got a rye crop with, you know, 3, 4, 5 inch growth on it, you'll be lucky to get 5 or 10 pounds of nitrogen in that per acre. So a little bit is taken up, and then of course you get some more in spring. But all winter long, that soil is full of that 100, 200 pounds of nitrogen that's floating around in the soil, and the water's washing it through. And so we're getting high concentrations in leaching water all winter long. We're just losing that nutrient, and it's not just the nitrogen, it's going to be the sulfur and the boron and other nutrients as well. So if we can just plant that cover crop earlier, get it started while there's still enough growing degree days to get some good growth in the fall and not wait until the spring, then we can change the situation. So now we got this big vigorous cover crop where, you know, the rye by Thanksgiving is a foot tall and the radishes are big, you know, and some of them are as big as your arms. You got a nice vigorous looking cover crop. That's going to result in substantial shoot growth, maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pounds of dry matter per acre in the fall, and that'll stay fairly dormant in the winter, and then that may go to 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 in the spring. That'll be a really nice cover crop. That's what to shoot for. The roots will also be deep. You can get down, you know, if you plant it early, we know from these experiments with the tracers that the roots are going to be able to get down to 5, 6, 7 feet deep in the fall, clean up that profile. And so we'll take up a lot of nitrogen, cleaning up that profile, you know, reducing the nitrate level all the way through the profile so that during the winter, the water is still leaching, still going through, but it's carrying very little nitrogen with it. It's going to be much lower. In the spring, we'll take up some more, and then hopefully we can make that available. Here on the right graph over here, once we terminate the cover crop, especially if we got some legumes and some brassicas in there, they release nutrients quickly, so we can enrich that topsoil while still having low levels in the subsoil. So the deep nutrients are the ones that are most at risk of being washed out and leached, and are beyond the reach of the young cash crop. What we do want is to have nutrients up near the surface near planting time. So we don't want to deplete the surface of nutrients at planting time, which is what some cover crops, of course, will do. So to get data to study this, so that's sort of the picture that we see now, the hypothetical model that we have based on kind of data that we've been collecting. So one way we collect this data is by using these suction lysimeters. These are just tubes with a ceramic tip, and we put suction on them, and this sucks in the water from the largest pores. You put a vacuum on the tube, it sucks in this water. So this is the gravitational water that's moving down and percolating through the profile and going to be lost to the groundwater and eventually end up in the bay. So we're sampling that. We have these, usually we sample this at 3 or 4 feet deep, about 1 meter deep. Okay. And we've been doing this now on dozens of fields and for a number of years, and we always find the same story. Cover crops are effective if you get them in early. So this is from Kent County. We're looking at samples taken in February and March and through April. And this is the nitrate level in the no cover crop. So there are weeds out there, but this is without a cover crop planted. So on all of these dates, that leaching water is much lower in nitrate. For any of the cover crop treatments, we had radish, we had a mixture of species, we had cereal rye, we had some planted in the 1st of September and some in the middle of September, but even the late ones here were planted early by the middle of September, and they were all effective. So we've been doing this on a number of different sites, and you can see the story is pretty similar. Again, here's data going in winter from February, some March data, some April samples. So, you know, winter and early spring, this is the peak leaching season. Here we're again looking at nitrate in this pore water at 90 centimeters or about 3 feet deep. It's on its way to the groundwater. Where we didn't plant a cover crop, we did have, you know, a cover of weeds, but we find that they're generally not effective at getting down deep and cleaning up that profile. And so there was a high level of nitrate here, around 200 parts per million, and increasing as the nitrate got pushed down, and we picking it up at 3 feet deep. The late planted, which is the 30th of September, that may not seem late to most of you, but you can see that basically it made a difference, but not much. Sometimes it was significant, sometimes it wasn't. But as we got into these early planting dates, like middle of August, 1st of September, that was able to keep the nitrate down during the whole season. This is just another site showing pretty much the same thing. Another site here emphasizing that these early planting dates, there's a reason why we have these cutoffs in the MDA subsidy program. You get extra money because if you plant early, we now know that this water is going to be pretty clean. You wait a few weeks in here. The problem here is you're losing all your growing degree days. All the warm days are lost. By the time the seed germinates that you planted on the 30th, you're into October, and it's not going to do enough growing, especially for the roots. If things are adverse above ground, the roots are going to suffer the most. So here you can see that once you've waited until 1st of October, 30th, there's not much difference between the weeds only and the cover and having a late cover crop. Another example of the same thing. So we're pretty well convinced that this is the picture because we keep seeing basically the same picture wherever we try this. We've also done some work with another graduate student, Nathan Sedge, and some folks over in Chestertown at the Washington College that we collaborated with. And we collaborated with full large-scale farmers. We looked at 6 fields. And here the treatment plots were put on by airplane for the early seeding treatments. And so we were doing a half of a field because you can't do little plots with an airplane. So this is an example of an irrigated field that was drilled after harvest versus flown on a few weeks before harvest. The time difference ranged from about 2 weeks to about 5 or 6 weeks. So it depended on the schedule of the plane and the situation on individual farms, but it was always earlier. And the data looked like this. Of course, it's a little bit messy and there's lots of variation from site to site and different. We had a number of these lysimeters lined up in these different fields, but each of these dots is one of these samples. But if you take a look at the running averages here of the regression line, this is without a cover crop on average. Now we're looking at nitrate nitrogen, by the way. The scale has changed, so the numbers are lower. It's fairly high in here, flirting with about 10 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, which is a drinking water standard. It's not particularly relevant, but it's just a reference point. Where we drilled the cover crops, or the farmers drilled the cover crops, and this was a 3-way mix of radish, a cereal, usually rye, and crimson clover. When they were drilled right after harvest, after either corn or soybeans, this is the data that we got. And then where we flew it on early, and you got a good start on this. You can see there were the occasional higher value, but almost all of these were very low. So earliness is important. We've done this also in a number of years. That was a fairly wet year. This is data showing similar samples at different depths. So you can see all these were planted early, but you can see the difference in species. Not much difference in species. They were all planted early. So whether it's a 3-way mix or rye or radish, nitrate was all low throughout the year. This is starting in November and running through January. So this is the late fall and winter. And without it, just the weeds, we had very high levels of nitrate, and they tended to fall in the shallow lysimeter. But then we picked that nitrate up at around 75 centimeters, and then we picked it up all season long at 100 centimeters. So big difference. Cover crops are effective. There's a reason why we plant them. So we want to look at this a little bit more detail. Okay, how can we benefit from this? And is it just nitrogen? We know that cover crops are taking up, all the nutrients that the cover crop needs, and then they release it. So this is just some of the methods that we use when we're harvesting cover crops and separating out the different species. Well, this timing issue comes up over and over again. What you're looking at in the picture here is a field that has just been planted, no-till planted to corn, planted green, at least in the part in the background on May 9th. The half in the foreground was terminated about a month earlier, so it's planted brown. And as you can see from the data here, this is the dry matter just of the clover. It's pretty obvious there's lots of clover in this. The earlier we planted in the fall, the more clover we got. So this first bar is where we planted on the 9th of September. Second bar was the 21st of September, 3rd of October, 17th of October. And this is without a cover crop, just weeds. So of course we had weeds growing. It's that early planting that gave us, a little more biomass in April, but it really was there, ready to take off when we gave it the month of May to grow. So we went from about 1,000 to about 6,000 or 7,000. That's kilograms per hectare of dry matter. And this is, a lot more nitrogen because most of this is clover. So the early planting really favored the clover. In fall, it looked like radish field. In spring, it looks like a clover field. The radish actually is kind of a nurse crop for the clover. The two do very well together. There's a synergy going on there. So that's,
Hey,
of course,
Ray,
yeah.
before you go on, we had a question.
Sure.
How do you gauge airspeed timing? We've had some misses because of drought, heat, and pre-sprouting.
You mean, what's the best time to do the air seeding? I'm going to hold off on the answer to that because we'll see some, generally earlier is better. So we've had situations where the seed sits in there, nothing happens because it's dry, it doesn't rain, and then it rains 2-3 weeks later and it germinates. If you have irrigation, I definitely suggest running the pivot once or maybe twice. Put a 1/3 of an inch on a couple of times. So I'm not sure if that's what the question is about.
Okay, thank you.
But I will have some examples of that. Okay, thanks for letting me know. So yeah, some of the considerations for planting earlier, that's obviously easier said than done. Even in research plots, it's pretty complicated to get it done sometimes, very weather dependent. There are different ways you can accomplish this. Probably the simplest thing is to go and plant some of your fields in very early corn hybrids. This is probably a smart thing to do anyway, because you're going to spread your risk. And some years the early hybrids really do well, and some years they don't. You don't know that in advance, so it'd be a good idea to have some percentage of your fields in very early hybrids. By very early, I mean 90, 95, 100-day hybrids. Spread it out. Well, those early fields are going to come off early enough that you can come in and just do standard drilling, all right, right after harvest. And that'll be one way to get it in early, at least on some of your farm. We've also used a high boy. I don't have a picture of it here right now. We don't have one of these real big spray rig jobs, but we have one that's actually designed for soybeans, but we go over corn with it. When we go over it in around tasseling time, it doesn't do any damage. It sort of brushes up against the corn a little bit. So if you have that kind of equipment, then that's becoming more popular. Although, there's one seeder in Delaware that we actually wanted to use, but it's so popular that we could never get a time with the machine. But that certainly gives you opportunities to go in pretty much anytime you want. Airplanes can go in. Usually they're freed up by August sometime. That's a good time to do that. There's also new equipment that's been developed at Penn State that's now commercialized. I'll show you, that allows you to drill in at lay-by. So around the pre-side dress time, corn V5, V6, you can go and drill in either corn, or if you have wide rows in soybeans, you could use 30-inch soybean rows and do that, although it works much better with corn. And then sort of the platinum opportunity, if you can pencil it out, is after a small grain harvest. So after you harvest barley or wheat and you're around the 1st of July, that would be a great opportunity to really hit a field, especially a problem field, with remediating cover crops that might also be able to enrich the fertility. If you're going to do that, you could really put in some summer cover crops that would relay with winter cover crops, species mixes, and maybe do some bio drilling on the crop row. There's lots of things we could talk about if you have that kind of growing degree days. And, double crop soybeans don't always make a lot of money. This is just to let you know what this new equipment does on this Interseeder. It's basically a drill. It also will, you can spray herbicides on the same trip and apply the side dress. So you do this at the time you were going to apply side dress nitrogen, but also plant the cover crop. So it plants 3 cover crop rows, and then the corn row, and then 3 cover crop rows. And this is available here. I just put, not giving them an advertisement, but these are the folks that bought the license and developed the commercial model from the Penn State University pioneering prototypes. So it's interseeder technologies. And this is what that type of interdrilling looks like. So this was drilled into soybeans, obviously a few weeks before this picture was taken. Looks great right now, but I have to tell you that soybeans are really dense. If you have a good stand of soybeans, it's going to get really dark down there. And there's not too much that will survive, although red clover does pretty well. And Steve Mirsky's had a lot of good luck with that. In corn, you have a lot more opportunities, a lot more light filters down into a corn, through a corn canopy. So this is the same 3-row drill. This was drilled when the corn was about V6 stage. And this is, this particular one is a 3-way mixture with some rye, radish, and clover in it. That's a mixture that I really like. This is what it looked like after harvest. So that's that same field. This is taken on October 2nd of this year. And, you have kind of an instant cover crop, and those roots, just from previous experience in our work, are probably already down at 4, 5, 6 feet deep, cleaning up that profile and bringing up nutrients. And this was a 3-way mix, but what you see mostly at this time of year is radish. The radish is going to die sometime in December or January in 9 out of 10 years. Occasionally there's a year where it doesn't die. I wouldn't worry about that either. It's a pretty wimpy plant in spring. It's a champion in fall, but it's a wimp in spring. And again, the timing makes so much difference. That clover is in there. It really likes to grow next to a radish plant. It really stimulates it. I think it may have something to do with the microbes and the sugars excreted by the radish. But the two really grow well together. And here you can see the difference between, so this is on May 9th. It was just planted green. This was planted October 3rd. Same seed, same mixture. This was planted September 11th, 3 weeks earlier. Hardly any clover in here, hardly any nitrogen in the whole system, right? It never got down there. And this one in fall looked like a radish field. And then the radish died. And now it looks like a clover field with a little bit of rye in it, and it's dark green and there's lots of nitrogen. Here's the nitrogen values right here. More than 200 kilograms of nitrogen in that clover. And if we kill it early, we're only getting a little bit. But if we let it grow, the month of May has got great growing weather for these plants. And the combination of planting early and killing late, now we've got some serious nitrogen here. And that's just looking at the nitrogen. Carbon is also important, but you want to be careful with it. You don't want to put too much carbon in front of a corn crop. You're going to have to put a lot of nitrogen down to make up for it. Carbon ties up nitrogen. This is data that Bill Curran presented, and I'm borrowing that from him. Actually, Steve Mirsky worked on this back in his graduate student days. So this is data from about 10 years ago. And this shows the same effect, in this case using rye, so it doesn't show these interactions between the species, but it shows the importance of planting early. This is the dry matter and thousands of pounds of cereal dry matter. This is the increase from the 30 days of letting it grow longer in spring, from May 1st to May 30th. And this is the increase from having planted it earlier. So this line is the one that was allowed to grow to May 30th. And here's the later planting. So you can see when you get past early September, even with rye in spring, you're still giving up a lot of growth, even if you let it grow. Now, this is really good for carbon in the soil. And as many of you know, there are schemes coming online now to pay farmers for putting that carbon in the soil, because when it's in the soil, if it stays in the soil, it not only improves your soil, so farmers ought to do it for free because it is going to make a much better soil. It's going to turn into organic matter, a portion of it. But that's carbon on a large scale that's not in the atmosphere. And as you know, that's one of the big challenges that is facing our species on this planet right now, is we put way too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we're warming the planet and causing all of this crazy weather, which is really the result. It's what we're experiencing in the last few years is exactly what the scientists predicted 20 years ago when they looked at those curves and ran the models and said, well, this is what it's going to do to the weather. This is climate change. Now we're seeing it. And we're seeing it in fires and droughts and all that kind of stuff. It's also good for weed suppression. This is a big, thick mat of biomass. So you can get away with a lot less herbicide, and it'll conserve a lot of water. So it does a lot of good things, but it will tie up nitrogen. This plant is growing until May 30th. It's sucking up all the nitrate, and that's in the surface where we would like to see nitrate. Remember, I showed that before. So if we use that three species mixture I talked about, we don't have the downside of this. But the Maryland Max program has recognized the importance of carbon now. It's been primarily nitrogen focused, keeping nitrogen out of the bay. But now they are going to give you, be willing to give you an extra payment of $10 to let the cover crop grow longer. And that's primarily a soil health and climate mitigation payment. That's what society gets for their $10. You get better soil and better long-term productivity. So all of that was about nitrogen. And if you take a look at the literature and look at cover crops and nutrients, almost all the papers are about nitrogen. A few of them are about phosphorus. So this is a logarithmic scale. I just did a quick search in the last 20 years, and I got about 1,000 papers that had nitrogen in cover crops in the title, about 100 that had phosphorus in cover crops, a few with potassium, and then you're in the single digits, like just one or two papers occasionally. And most of these weren't very useful. So almost nobody studies the possibility that cover crops could help with other areas of nutrition, plant nutrition. So I wanted to take a look at that. So I took advantage of a study I had going we had a 12 species cover crop mix. Now, this is not something I'm recommending you go out and do, although it was only about $48 per acre of seed. But it had 4 different legumes, 4 different brassicas, and 4 different grasses, just cereals. And we were interested in knowing which of these species would do best in the interseeding mode. So we interseeded them with that air seeder, high boy air seeder, into 3 different corn hybrids. They were all early, but some were earlier than others. And we did it on 2 soils. And then we compared that to drilling the cover crop after harvest on those different dates. So I'm not going to go into all the details on that. Here you can kind of see when we did the interseeding, and we did it as early as in July and in August, and then we drilled after harvest, and then we terminated it and sampled soil in June at PSMT time. So here's some of the data from that. This is the fall harvest, so this is early December. And I didn't separate out the species. We just separated it out by family at that point because there were no flowers on it. It'd be kind of hard to do by species. And you can see that when we interseeded in July, now that actually was seeded in early July, but it didn't germinate until late July. The seeds sat there for 3 weeks. We had no rain that year in July, it was 2018. But when it rained, it germinated and it produced a very nice cover crop. In August, it didn't do quite as well, and then drilling it was less. So, we just didn't have the growing degree days left. We had a good stand, but there wasn't much there. And you can see that the composition is changing, right? This early one really favored the brassicas and the legumes, and the later one, later planting favors the grasses. In spring, we were able to tease out the individual species. So we have 11 species here. The radish was dead, so we couldn't measure that. And so we've got these red and yellow colors are the grasses, the wheat, triticale, cereal rye, and annual ryegrass. And the greens are the legumes. So the big ones are, this is red clover and crimson clover, little hairy vetch in here. And white clover was that one. And then we had the brassicas, which were kale, rape, and turnip. In the fall, there was a lot more brassica because that was radish, but it died. And of course, there was a lot of weed suppression here. Not many weeds growing with all of that. That's what it looked like. But we had some weeds where we didn't have a cover crop. And then we wanted to look at the nutrients in these. So we had separated these out and analyzed the nutrient contents. And not surprisingly, the legumes had the highest nitrogen. Now this is, let me preface, this is the December harvest. So this is what we get out of, a lot of this is radish in here in the brassica. The dominant brassica at that time was radish. And a lot of the legumes were all that mixture. So the legumes were high in nitrogen, no surprise. The brassicas are distinctly higher in sulfur, like way higher. 4 times as high. You can cycle a lot of sulfur using brassica cover crops. They'll bring it down, from deep in the soil. That sulfate leaches out, and then they can bring it up to the surface where other crops can use it. Phosphorus is also, you can do a lot of phosphorus remediation and moving around with cover crops, especially the brassicas are good at that. So this is, again, the fall data that has got a lot of forage radish in it. Potassium also is quite high in the brassicas. Calcium is much higher in the broadleaves than it is in the grasses, and boron is distinctly higher in the brassicas and the legumes than in the grasses. So we can cycle quite a bit of boron by including brassicas and legumes in the cover crop. If we look at some of the ratios of nutrients, it's even more distinct. We got a very nice lineup here of nitrogen to sulfur ratio. Brassicas are really high in sulfur, moderately high in nitrogen, so that's low. The brassicas and the legumes are fairly low in sulfur relative to nitrogen. The brassicas, of course, are in the calciphore family, and so they're really high in calcium compared to magnesium, so sometimes that's an issue. Again, in potassium, the brassicas and grasses are higher, and the sulfur boron ratios. In spring, we had a similar story. Now remember that it's not quite comparable because the radishes are out of the picture here, but we still had those other 3 brassicas. Nitrogen still higher, hasn't changed much. The advantage of brassicas is a little bit less in the spring. On these are fully mature flowering plants, and phosphorus is a little bit lower in concentration, but bigger biomass. Nothing very remarkable about the potassium, but the calcium and boron is still quite a bit higher in those broadleaf cover crops. And the ratios are similar to what we saw in the fall. So there's distinct patterns here by family. And that's, I'm averaging out these different species, but you can see that that's justified. Just as an example, take a look at sulfur. All the grasses were pretty low in sulfur. This is 2 different soils, a very sandy field and a silty field. So there wasn't much difference due to the soil, but the grasses were all low, the legumes were all medium, and the brassicas were all high. So I feel that, looking at the family is probably where it's at. Then we came in about 2 months after termination and sampled the soil. This was at the time that you normally do a PSNT. It was in late-ish June. And enough of these nutrients had already been released so that the Melick soil test was picking them up. We had significant increase in sulfur. This is still fairly low in sulfur, but was a significant increase. A major increase here in phosphorus. And that can be good, that can be bad. That's bringing phosphorus up to where it can certainly run off, but it can also be taken up by the crop. So if you've got a good cover crop, especially if it has legumes and brassicas in it, you probably don't want to be applying additional phosphorus, even if your soil test would allow that, if the soil test that you had previous, because that cover crop's probably bringing up a lot of phosphorus unless it's phosphorus deficient. You can probably see that. Some of the micronutrients are also significantly cycled, like copper and zinc. So we might be able to improve and utilize those nutrients as well. So in summary, the cover crops are taking up agronomically significant amounts of nutrients. And it's not just nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, calcium, micronutrients, they're all taken up. And if you're producing a high cover crop biomass, this is a significant amount of nutrients that should be enough to make a difference to cash crops. And the cover crops are taking it from deep down and where it's dispersed and concentrating it near the surface and putting it into a readily plant available form. So we should be able to take advantage of this. Planting our cover crops, one of the things we want to think about is, are there specific nutrients that we're low on that we could probably correct using cover crop management strategy. So with that, I'll take questions.